Yeah, man, my name is Jimmy. I come from Jamaica, bro. We're gonna sing Motto Vu. Oh, 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 oh. Motto Vu. Ohalecha Yaakov. Bishkelotecha Yisrael. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov. Mishkelotecha Yisrael. This comes from the portion of Balak. Bilam thinks he's gonna curse Israel. But really, in the end, his plan derails into nothing and it ends up blessing Israel. Matavu alecha Yaakov. Mishkanotecha Yisrael. Bilam thinks he's bad. He's really good because he blessed Israel instead of putting them in a bad mood. He did not curse them. He did bless them. He blessed them with these words. Matavu alecha Yaakov. Mishkenotecha Yisrael. Matavu alecha Yaakov. Mishkenotecha Yisrael. Yo, Bilam did not curse Israel. He ended up blessing them with the following words. Matavu ohalecha Yaakov. Mishkenotecha Yisrael. He talked to a donkey, beat it up. He beat it up. But the donkey still loved him a lot and told him a lot. But he ended up being bad. He never turned a new leaf. He ended up being a villain forever and ever and ever and ever. Matavu alecha Yaakov. Mishkenotecha Yisrael. Matavu ohalecha Yaakov. Mishkenotecha Yisrael. Everybody listen, gather around. Matavu ohalecha Yaakov. Mishkenotecha Yisrael. Listen to those words. Research them. The translation in English. They are good. Good words Bilam spoke, but he meant to curse Israel. He ended up blessing them instead. The donkey helped a lot, but he still ended up being bad. Matavu ohalecha Yaakov. Mishkenotecha Yisrael. Matavu ohalecha Yaakov. Mishkenotecha Yisrael. Matavu ohalecha Matavu ohalecha Yaakov. Mishkenotecha Yisrael.
Well, Shavua Tov, everyone. On behalf of Yeshivat Shuvu and Ahavat Imi Ministries, I'm Moriah Jackson Edwards, and it's my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to Havdalah and Maasei Shlichim. It's a time of the week at the end of Shabbat in which we, together with you, are reciting Havdalah, the closing blessings of the Shabbat, the separation of the Shabbat from the next week. And also, we're listening together to a very special teaching on the book of Acts, the book of Maasei Shlichim, the deeds or the acts of the apostles, the acts of the sent out ones. This is a very special broadcast. We ask that you share it and like it and get the word out to all your friends. I would like to ask you for prayer at this time. We have the great launch of Yeshivat Shuvu in French that is happening as we speak over this weekend in Paris. I'm sure you've seen the live broadcast today out of Paris. It is incredible, and we do pray for your strong support during this time as we're launching there, and we have a really great traction and interest there in Paris. And there's tons of work. We've been working around the clock to make this a reality. Yeshivat Shuvu, the complete Shuvu platform, all available to French speakers. And so if you know anyone who speaks French from Paris or from France or other places, please let them know about this. It's fr.shuvu.tv. Lastly, I would ask that you partner with us in the global outreach ministry. If you are blessed by what we do and you want to partner with us, a great place to do that is fundly.com/operation-geulah. That's fundly.com/operation-geulah. We ask that you give and give generously, as this is a gift to each and every one of you of all the work that we're doing, of the many broadcasts and everything that is going on. So we do pray that you would give and give generously and be part of the global work. We are coming now to Havdalah. This is page number 87 of the Avat Olam Siddur. And as I like to say every week, there's the line of Lecha Dodi which goes like this: Sof Maasei b'machshava techila. It's the last in deed, but first in thought. It's the last thing we do of the week, which is the Shabbat, but Shabbat is the first thing that we think about as we enter into the new week. So as we recite Havdalah together, we are already thinking of the coming Shabbat as we're concluding this Shabbat. It's the last in deed, but the first in thought. Hine Yeshuati Eftach velo evchad Ki hozi v'zimhat yadonai Vayehi li Yeshua Ushavtem mayim besason Mimane Yeshua Ladonai Yeshua Lamecha Vichatecha Sela Adonai Tzvaot Imanu Miskav Lanu Elohei Yaakov Selah Adonai Tzvaot Ashrei Adam Boteach Bach Adonai Hoshia Melech Yaneinu Yom Koreinu Leyehudim Ha'etahora V'simcha v'sason v'ikar Hayray 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 Kenti elanu Kos yishutasa Uv'shem Adonai ekar Lay lay la 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 lay 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 la 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 lay lay ya la lay 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 ay ay lay la lay ay lay la 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 lay 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 la 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 lay lay ya la lay lay ay lay ay ay lay ay lay Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pli hagefen borei pli hagefen hey la 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 ya Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei v'samim borei minei v'samim lay lay la 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 lay 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 la 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 lay lay ya la lay 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 la lay 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 la 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 lay 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 la 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 lay lay ya la lay 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei me'orei ha'esh borei me'orei ha'esh lay la 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 lay 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 la 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 lay lay ya la lay 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 la 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 lay 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 la 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 lay lay ya la lay 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil bein kodesh lechol hamavdil bein kodesh lechol bein ol lechoshech bein ol lechoshech bein Yisrael elamim bein yom hashvihi לששת ימי המעשה ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לחול לחיים everyone שבוע טוב שבוע טוב שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב. We are greeting Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, who we know is the precursor, the one who comes before Mashiach ben David. As we welcome Eliyahu Hanavi into the door, we know that behind him stands Mashiach Yeshua, Mashiach ben David. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi. Bimmeha yavo eleinu im Mashiach, Mashiach ben David. Bimmeha yavo eleinu im Mashiach, Mashiach ben David. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi. Bimmeha yavo eleinu im Mashiach, Mashiach ben David. 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 It is now my great pleasure to welcome Mora Amy Moody, who has a very special teaching for us tonight on the book of Acts. I'm turning it over to you, Amy, for the teaching. Thanks so much, and Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shalom. I am so excited that I get to join you for our next installment in the continued journey through the book of Acts. Today we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 14, verses 1 through 20. So let's take a look at what it says. In Iconium, the same thing happened. They entered as usual into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a large number of Jewish and Greek people believed. But the Jewish people who would not believe stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their mind against the brothers. So they stayed there a considerable time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was testifying to the message of his grace, granting signs and wonders to come about by their hands. But the population of the city split. Some were with the Jewish leaders, and some were with the emissaries. Now it happened that an attempt was made by both the Gentile and the Jewish people, along with the rulers, to abuse and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to Lycaonia on the cities of Lystra and Derbe and the surrounding countryside. There they proclaimed the good news. Now a man was sitting in Lystra without strength in his feet, lame from birth, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. When Paul looked intently at him and saw that they had faith to be healed, he said in a loud voice, "Stand up on your feet." And the man leapt up and began to walk around. Now the crowd, seeing what Paul had done, lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have become like men and come down to us." And they began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the main. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was before the front gate of the city, brought bulls and garlands. He wanted to offer a sacrifice with the people. But when the emissaries, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their clothes and rushed out among the crowd, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We too are human, just like you. We proclaim the good news to you, telling you to turn from worthless things to the living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is with them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to go their own ways. Yet he did not leave himself without a witness. He did good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling your hearts with joy and gladness." Even saying these things, they were barely restrained the crowd from sacrificing to them. But the Jewish people came from Antioch and Iconium after they won the crowd over and stoned Paul. And they were dragging him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. But while the disciples surrounded him, he got up and went back into the city. On the next day, he left with Barnabas for Derbe. Okay, so here we're starting to see a pattern, right? Paul goes into a city. Some gladly receive the message of the good news, and others reject it aggressively. This pattern repeats over and over again. But we also see another pattern repeating, and that is the zeal of Paul. What is the first thing he does after being stoned to the point that the observers think he's dead? He goes right back into the city. Are you kidding me? That is bold. And yes, he leaves for Derbe, but he quickly returns. We see later in the chapter, he comes right back to the cities he just left, back to the cities that stoned him. He wasn't done with that city. He knew he still had to establish a leadership group. So he comes right back. What is it about Paul that made him risk his life here and so many other times? He had zeal. And I know we often talk about this, especially in relationship to Paul, but do we really understand what it means to have zeal? Well, we're going to talk about that. But before we do, we have to talk about the consequences of not having zeal. And I'm mostly going to read from the book, The Path of the Just. Ramchal writes a great deal here about what it means to have zeal and what it means to not have zeal. So let's read. Shlomo further said, also, he who is slack in his work is a brother to the destroyer. For even though this person is not a destroyer who commits evil directly with his own hands, don't think he is far removed from being one. On the contrary, he is the destroyer's brother and his comrade. Wow. What's being communicated here is if you lack zealousness, you're an ally to destruction. Being idle is not a neutral position. It's actually a negative position, extremely negative. So let's keep reading from the same source. That is, the evil that befalls the lazy man does not come all at once. Rather, it comes little by little, without his knowing it or sensing it. He's pulled from one evil to another until he finds himself sunk in ultimate evil. Yikes. So the consequences of idleness don't hit you all at once. It's slow. You might not even see the consequences of idleness for some time. And we see this is true with a lot of bad decisions, right? If you're an alcoholic, in the beginning stages, it might seem fun and carefree, and you probably won't see the destructive results of killing your liver or eventually losing your family until years of abuse. Same thing with our diet. We can eat all that junk that causes heart disease, and it won't show up for years. Smoking, same thing. I mean, I could go on and on. The same idea is true with those who don't act with the spirit of zealousness. You may not see the bad consequences, but don't let that fool you to thinking there are none. The Ramchal continues. His destruction is like all those who breach fences. Shlomo continues, then I observed, I put my heart to it. I reflected on this matter and realized the great evil in it, for it is like a poison which creeps and spreads little by little. Its effect is not noticed until death comes. This is the meaning of a little sleep. So shall your destitution come swiftly as a traveler. So in the end, the result is death. But I would ask a question. Is it the death of the idle person? Or is there a greater death? Is there a death in the community? The community that is not getting served because of idleness and a lack of zealousness. So what's being referred to here as lazy, what's translated into English as lazy, is not referring to someone that just sits around all day watching TV. That's not what this is referring to. It's referring to a person that's not engaged in mitzvot. I could be a very busy person. I can work all day. Go to work all day, come to my house, work on my house projects. I can work my fingers to the bone. But if I'm not engaged in mitzvot, then all that I'm about to read to you here is applicable. This is what is being referred to by a lazy person. It's not referring to a couch potato. It's referring to someone who is idle in the service of God. Let's continue reading. He thus says, I will eat a bit, I will sleep a little, or it's difficult for me to leave my house. I have to put off my coat, how shall I put it on again? Or maybe he says it's very hot outside, or it's very cold, or it's raining, and all the other sorts of excuses and rationalizations that the mouth of lazy people are full of. Either way, In the meantime, the Torah is abandoned, the service of God is idle, and a man abandons his creator. This is what Shlomo said. By laziness, the ceiling decays, and through the lowering of hands, the house leaks. So notice, this person has all the reasons in the world they cannot be engaged in the service of God. We've all seen this. Oh, I've got a big project at work, or I'll start helping with that when insert excuse here. And if we're being perfectly honest with ourselves, we've probably all done this to some extent. But look what it says about the person who does this. It says that they've abandoned their creator. That's really strong language. And here's what's so sad and scary about this. This person has no idea their state of being. So let's look at the story of the fig tree that everybody talks about in light of this concept. And this is from Mark 11. Yeshua entered Jerusalem. He went to the temple courts and took a good look at everything. But since it was now late, he went out with the 12 to Bethany. The next day, they came back from Bethany, and he felt hungry. Spotting in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came up to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it wasn't fig season. And he said, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his Talmudim heard what he said. Now, this fig tree had a very good reason for not having fruit. It wasn't fig season. Yeshua is telling us that our excuses may be true. They may be valid, but they shouldn't stop us. They should never keep us from bearing fruit. And how do we bear fruit? We get to work in the service of the Creator. Let's keep reading. If you ask the lazy person to explain his behavior, he will confront you with numerous quotations of the sages, verses from scripture, and logical arguments of all which instruct him, according to his distorted mind, to be lenient with himself and to leave himself in the tranquility of his laziness. But he fails to see that all these arguments and reasons do not stem from a balanced reasoning, but rather spring from the wellspring of laziness, which, as it strengthens over him, inclines his views and his intellect to those arguments. Hence, he fails to heed the voice of the wise and the men of sound judgment. This is what Shlomo screams out: the lazy man in his own eyes is wiser than 7 men who answer sensibly. For laziness does not allow him to even be concerned for the words of those who rebuke him. Rather, he will consider them all to be mistaken or foolish, while he alone is the wise one. This person isn't ignorant of the Torah. They know what the Chazal say. He quotes them. He quotes all the verses. He knows all the scripture. But he twists things to justify his lack of action. So we might look at this guy with respect when he's actually headed for destruction. This is why Yeshua warns us. Every healthy tree produces good fruit, but a poor tree produces bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, or a poor tree produce good fruit. Any tree that does not produce good fruit is cut down and thrown in the fire. So you will recognize them by their fruit. So what's the fruit? Let's keep reading. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only those who do what my Father in heaven wants. So what we have to do is be careful not to let others lure us into inaction with their same idleness. We can't let their lofty words convince us that the inaction is okay. So we actually have to look past at the things they're saying and look at what they do. We look at their fruit. So here's Paul. He has every reason not to go back in that same place and put himself in harm's way. And actually, there's plenty of sages that say you have no obligation to do a mitzvot if that puts you in harm's way. He could have clung to those excuses and not gone back. He could have stayed in the more friendly communities and just continue to build and strengthen those communities. He had a pretty good excuse, but he was zealous. So he pursued. So now that we know what it isn't, what does its execution look like? Well, the Ramchal breaks it down into two parts. One is the action before a mitzvah, and the second is after it has started. He basically says that as soon as the thought enters your mind, do it. Don't waste any time. He says the biggest delay, he says that delay is the biggest danger to a mitzvot, to mitzvot. That's amazing. You would think that it would be resources or understanding of a mitzvah or a million other things that would be way more dangerous. But no, it's time. It's delaying at all, even for a second, the doing of a mitzvah. Every second that passes between you considering a good deed and doing it is an opportunity for a new obstacle to come in and present itself and keep you from doing the mitzvah. The second part of zeal is the action after you have started. We have to keep pursuing its completion. Not so that we can cross it off our checklist and feel better about having done it. No, it's that we need to act with zeal, with the fear that we may lose the merit to do the mitzvah. And its completion is important because what's the reward for its completion? Ethics of the Father says that the reward for doing a mitzvah is the opportunity to do another. It's a snowball effect. You start off with one mitzvah, and then you keep doing it. And pretty soon it's a snowball effect, and it just becomes part of your daily life, and it grows on itself. So we have to be zealous for its completion so we can do another one. Bereshit Rabbah 85:3 says something really sobering. It says, one who begins a mitzvah but doesn't complete it buries his wife and his sons. Now, this is clearly not literal, or we would cease to exist as a human race. But at first glance, it actually seems to contradict what Ethics of the Father says when it says you are not obligated to complete a work, but neither are you free to desist from it. What it's conveying here is the seriousness in which we must undertake these mitzvot. The same zeal in which we start with, we have to maintain. And if you think about it, how many times does our zeal wane as we pursue something? And even in the context of the ordinary, say I'm going to do some housing project, and you go into it, you get all the tools, you think everything through, you have a great vision of what the end product is going to look like, and you get started, and you're so excited to start, right? But then it's dirty and things don't work right, and you're sweaty and gross, and you've hit your finger with a hammer 10 times, and you're just done. You don't have the same zeal. This is what the Midrash and the Ethics of the Father is warning us against. That same zeal we had in the beginning, we have to persist with that same zealousness throughout the entire process. That is what Paul is demonstrating. He's not satisfied with how things were left in that community. He refused to desist from spreading the good news, even to those who tried to kill him. His zealousness was manifest in haste. Haste to do the action after we have committed to doing it, and haste to complete it. Scripture is full of those who have this zealous haste. Abraham was zealous in his haste, in his actions with the 3 visitors, right? And feeding them and caring for them, even though he was at the height of pain from his circumcision. We see that he was running to serve them. Isaac was zealous to the point of death when Abraham was asked to sacrifice him. He went along. He was willing to die. Another person that was zealous to the point of death was Moses. And I know what you're thinking. Moses died of natural causes. But think about this. Back in Numbers 20, Moses was told he would not enter the promised land, that he was going to die before the nation entered. So every single action he took after hearing that to hasten the people entering the land is inching him closer and closer to his own death. Every battle that brought them closer, every time Israel rebelled, every time Moses intervened for them, he was bringing them closer to the land, closer to entering it, and closer to his own death. He was acting in a zealous haste to get his people into the land, knowing that his haste was going to bring about his own death. His only concern is for God and the community, nothing for self. And this is exactly the same spirit we see in Paul. Let's read how this zealousness is described. You can see that a man whose soul is a fire in the service of the Creator certainly will not become lazy in doing the mitzvot. Rather, his movements will be like the quick movements of fire, for he will not rest nor be still until he has finished completing the deed. Again, this is Paul. He was not okay with leaving the community how it was. Even though he had every excuse, he would not rest even after being stoned. He insisted on coming back. His soul burned with zeal, and it caused him to act. It was internal to external. But what if that's just not you? You love the Torah, you respect the mitzvot, but zeal? Maybe despite all the coffee you drink, trying to change the way you feel on the inside, you can't seem to get to a place of true zeal. It's okay, because this one works both ways. It can be external to internal. Let me read. Reflect further that just like an inner fieriness of the soul leads one to act with zeal, so too the opposite. Outwardly acting with zeal leads to an inner fieriness of the soul. Namely, when one feels himself performing a mitzvot with great swiftness, this will move his inner being to kindle a flame also, and the desire that and want will increasingly intensify with him. But if he acts in a sluggish manner in the movement of his limbs, so too the movement of his spirit will die down and extinguish. This is something experience can testify to. But for a man in whom this longing does not burn as it should, a good advice for him is to act with zeal by a force of will, in order that this will bring an inner awakening of this longing in his inner nature. For the external movement rouses the inner ones, and certainly the external movement is more in his power than the inner ones. Thus, if he exercises what it is in his power to do, this will lead him to also obtain what is not in his power. For an inner joy will awaken with him, and a desire and a longing through the power of acting fierily, externally, by the force of will. This is what the prophet said. Let us run to know the Lord. And after God they will go, who shall roar like a lion. That is so encouraging. It's like there's this hidden spark of zeal in all of us, just waiting to be kindled into a fire. It's like one of those little firecrackers, that are so tiny, but you light them and bam, this huge explosion. That's what's hidden inside of us. And some of us are zealous with our studies, which is good, but that in and of itself is not what we're talking about. Let me read a short transcript from a speech given by Rabbi Joseph Slavovicek. He says in his speech, I believe that one of the greatest deficiencies with the American so-called modern Orthodox is while intellectually everyone is very developed, I must tell you that these students are true scholars. I wouldn't say everyone, but a large group are true scholars. They would be considered scholars in Jerusalem as well. And he jokingly says, I'm simply a good rabbi. I meet many Jews who keep mitzvot, but it seems to me that everyone lacks the fire, the enthusiasm, these yearnings, the religious mood that we Jews must have on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and the rest of the year. Why is this fire of zealousness so important? Zealousness corrects the other negative qualities, and it enhances the good ones. A zealous person is a brave person. We certainly see that in Paul. We see it in Moses. We see it in Phineas. Show me a zealous person, and I will show you a brave person. A zealous person has fear. He has fear of heaven, fear of God, but he doesn't have fear for himself. Look at Paul. When he was stoned, he had to be thinking, this is the end, right? Yet when he found himself alive, did he have fear of it happening again? Not at all. He kept on going. Scripture tells us over and over again not to fear. Scripture is not telling us to hunker down and avoid hard things. It's telling us to face them. And that's why it's telling us not to have fear, because it's encouraging us to face these scary things and not have fear. A zealous person is also a person that is grateful. You cannot have a spirit of entitlement or be an ingrate and be zealous. It's like oil and water. A zealous person will consider themselves to be nothing, so that they're ready to work zealous haste for the service of God. For the zealous person, the master's priorities are their priorities. Perhaps more importantly, the fire of a zealous person spreads to their community. For certain, there are going to be people who will rise up and fight against you. But ignore them, just like Paul did. Because there are going to be people that will see your fire and they will want that fire too. Now, there's one other person in the Torah that is described as acting with a zealous haste. Rivka. In fact, this word in Hebrew is used in conjunction to her more than anyone else in the Torah. So if you've read Rabbi's book on this, you should get excited. You see, the zealous nature is not limited to the Jewish people, like Paul, for example. It's for the non-Jews too. Rabbi's whole book describes what happens when non-Jews wake up this spark of zealousness, and it ignites and explodes within us. Here's what Rabbi Shapiro said about this haste. I'm going to read from his book here. The words of Rav Shaul, Paul, come alive through the story of Rivka. So, then you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but you are fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household. To play a part in the redemption birthing process, Rivka had to transform her own identity to become a lily. Her desire to hasten her wedding by running out and interrupting the words of Eliezer shows her willingness to hasten the ultimate redemption, which is midrashically represented by her wedding to Isaac, the Messiah. So Rivka and Shaul Paul, even though they're coming from different backgrounds, they have the same spirit of zeal. In this part in Acts, we see Paul is stoned, and there's a debate as to whether he died or was just injured to the point of death. Either way, he was resurrected to go back into the city. This ties to Rivka. In his book, Rabbi points out that Rivka had a resurrection process that she had to go to, that she had a rising up from the grave, so that she can continue on this path of zeal for the service of God. So if Paul had to go through his resurrection experience and Rivka had hers, we shouldn't be surprised when we have to go through ours. Rivka really didn't know what she was getting into when she committed to marry Isaac, but she accepted anyway. Paul had no idea what he was getting into when he started spreading the good news to Gentiles. They both did it anyway. Why? Zeal. Remember what we discussed earlier. You cannot delay in executing your commitment to the service of God. These two, they didn't delay. They did what the master wanted, and that was enough. They didn't need to know the what, when, and where. So you may be thinking, well, that's great for them. They had a job. But God hasn't told me to leave my family, to run off with someone like Rivka has told me to do, or was told to do. I haven't been told to go to the other nations to spread the good news like Paul. God hasn't told me to do anything. So I'm just going to sit back and wait for the word of the Lord to give me direction. No, wrong. The Torah is full of instruction on how we are to treat people, how to reach out in loving kindness to others, to care for the widow, care for the orphan. Pick a mitzvah. I don't care which one. Just pick one and do it. You really cannot expect God to give you some great exotic mission when you can't handle the ones he's already given you. I'm going to quote you one of my favorite lines from Rabbi's book. Christianity harbors the great potential of releasing the concealed spark of holiness that holds the secret for the complete redemption, which is trapped within it. What is trapping this spark of holiness? Idleness, the opposite of zeal. Who is to release this great potential? You. This movement that believes and supports the framework of Judaism, but also believes that Yeshua that believes Yeshua is the Messiah. It's really a small movement in comparison to all the other faith traditions out there. And it's certainly growing, right? And I believe, and probably you do too, believe that everyone will come to believe as we do, right? Someday everyone will believe this way. But right now, there's not that many of us. And if you're watching this, then you are certainly part of this small remnant. You. I love asking people how they came into this faith. I love hearing their stories because there's not a lot of second and third generation Messianic believers. I believe that's going to change, but for now, it's mostly made up of first generation believers. So when you ask how they came into this, you don't hear a whole lot of, oh, my parents and grandparents were Messianic, so I just grew up this way. Now, I look forward to the day when that is the standard answer. I want that answer for my kids, my grandkids. But for now, when you ask this question, you hear amazing stories. And the one thing that is true in all of these stories is this unexplainable pull they had and how much grief they got when they answered that call. I'm sure you have the same thing going on in your life. And all these stories just reinforce what I firmly believe to be true. The world will be ignited and changed forever by the work of just a few. If you have this pull, please do not let idleness destroy you. Please be zealous. Don't let idleness destroy you from playing your part in this great redemption story. I pray that you have the zealousness that Paul has, that Rivka has. Join us in this movement. We need you. Shalom.
Yeah, man, my name is Jimmy. I come from Jamaica, bro. We're gonna sing Mato Vu. Oh, 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 Mato Vu, oh Halecha, Yaakov. בשכנותיך ישראל, מה טובו אוהליך יעקב. משכנותיך ישראל. This comes from the portion of Balak. Bilam thinks he's gonna curse Israel, but really in the end his plan derails into nothing and it ends up blessing Israel. מה טובו עליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. Bilam thinks he's bad, he's really good because he blessed Israel instead of putting them in a bad mood. He did not curse them, he did bless them. He blessed them with these words: מה טובו עליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. מה טובו אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. Yo, Bilam did not curse Israel, he ended up blessing them with the following words: מה טובו אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. He talked to a donkey, beat it up. He beat it up. But the donkey still loved him a lot and it taught him a lot. But he ended up being bad. He never turned a new leaf. He ended up being a villain forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. מה טובו עליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. מה טובו אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. Everybody listen, gather around. מה טובו אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. Listen to those words. Research them. The translation in English, they are good. Good words Bilam spoke, but he meant to curse Israel. He ended up blessing them instead. The donkey helped a lot, but he still ended up being bad. מה טובו עליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. מה טובו אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. מה טובו אוהליך, מה טובו אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך משכנותיך ישראל ישראל מה טוב